Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to say, as I always do, that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. So we would ask that you consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justincenter.org and go to our donate page there and learn how you can help us out financially. You can check out some of our books and other resources as well that we provide. Go to jspublishing.org to see some of the works that we publish, both original works as well as a lot of reprints of some classic theological texts that hopefully you will find useful. We try to keep the price as low as we possibly can for those to give some affordable resources for the church as well. So if you want to check out some of our newer publications, I would urge you to check out Nathan Greeley's book, Christian Apologetics, A Lutheran Introduction, my recent book, In Defense of the True, Good, and the Beautiful. And I would also mention a recent book that we have released that is an older reprint that is from our Complete Works of Revere Franklin Widener series. This is his Christology. So we just released that, and this Christology is on the person and work of Christ from a Lutheran perspective. It's part of his dogmatics text. He had a number of volumes on various dogmatic topics. They're excellent. Some of my favorite works. We put out a bunch of those. So you can check that out, jspublishing.org. All right. Now, and one more thing, I guess, before I start with the topic of the podcast, I do just want to mention that some of you know I'm serving an interim position at a church in upstate New York. It's an LCMS church, Redeemer Lutheran Church in Auburn, New York. I'm going to post a link to the website below on YouTube, and I know some of you are listening on the podcast audio, but if you're watching on YouTube, you can find a link to the website. If you know anybody in the upstate New York, broader Syracuse area, I would recommend or just mention that if you are looking for a church, that you can check the church out. I'll be there preaching, filling in for a while there between pastors, so it's been a blessing to serve there. And I will be serving there for a little while, seemingly. So please do come, regardless of whether I'm there or not. But and if you do want to listen, I do have some sermons up. I started putting up my sermons again under Proclaiming Law and Gospel, which is a podcast feed you can find, through Spotify. I'm always wary of putting sermons up just because I don't like when people just listen to sermons online and don't go to church, because that's not what God has ordained, so don't do that. But if you feel like listening for whatever reason, you can, just as long as you recognize that you should be in your local church. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to jump again into the topic of last time, which was the discussion about Michael Heiser and the divine council theory. So I received a lot of comments on the podcast, and that's kind of what I expected. I mean, I know that he's a figure that is one who has a lot of very devoted fans, and they, as I mentioned, they are often very wary of anybody who's critical of his thesis in any way. So I expected some pushback, which, pushback is good, so I'm not complaining about that. Some of the pushback was absurd, but most of it wasn't. Most of it was genuine questions and discussion and points to push back and say, hey, I don't know that you represented this part accurately, or have you thought about this thing or that? And that's good. I did see somebody commenting that I don't believe in the supernatural. I'm a naturalist, and like all this weird stuff that clearly makes no sense with anything that I've said, if you've listened to anything I've ever said. And someone else was saying that I said that Michael Heiser is not really a Christian. And like, I don't know where anyone on earth would get any of that from. But I guess people just tend to just make stuff up. So I don't know. But the majority of you didn't do that, which I appreciate. I had some helpful feedback. So I know that there was a discussion on the channel called Sentinel Apologetics. I was not familiar with the channel before. And I know that they did a response to me. I was tagged in it and looked at it and saw that it was 4 hours. I just don't have the time to sit through a 4-hour response. I really don't. I don't mean that as like I'm better than that, but my schedule's insane enough. I can't do that. So I won't be able to listen to the full thing. I don't know how you guys have 4 hours to listen to anything like that. That's crazy, but it's good if you do, I guess. So anyway, I'm not going to respond to that because I just don't have the time to get through all of that. But I know a number of people sent it to me and told me about it. So maybe there are some points that I could bring out there that if you found certain timestamps or things that he said that you think would be worth responding to or answering, that would be great too. but I won't watch the whole thing. I'm not going to have the time. And if I have 4 hours, there are other things that I'll be doing. Okay, so I wanted to mention one thing that I got, two things I think that were probably the biggest points of pushback that I heard. One is that I did use the term demon in reference to the lower Elohim, whereas Michael Heiser restricts the term demon, most particularly to those spirits of the Nephilim who are without homes. So, and they are looking for homes, which is part of why demonic possession occurs. And I used that broader term, demonic, and I had a lot of people responding to me like, you clearly don't understand what he's saying because he used this term in a different way. Now, I'm certainly open to saying I was wrong and I misunderstood something, but in this case, I didn't. I understand how he's using the term demon. I read his work on demons, and I have read his The Unseen Realm and his supernatural book at this point, and he mentions this numerous times. So I'm aware of this. This is one of the difficulties of just the podcast format when you're talking about something, because when I'm writing an article or writing a book and I'm responding to somebody, you're very careful about your words. When you're podcasting, you just say things and things can slip out. And with certain figures that you respond to, people are kind of waiting for anything they can grab onto to dismiss your argument by saying, you misunderstood. I understand that he's using a different, more restrictive sense of the word demon, just as he uses a more restrictive sense of the word angel, because he believes angel is more of a job description. He says the seraphim, for example, are not angels. So what I was really doing there is switching back and forth between what he's saying and what I would categorize as a demon. So he's saying that the lower Elohim, these lesser Elohim, these false gods, when I say they're demonic entities, I'm using demonic entities in the sense that I usually use the term, not in the restricted sense in which Heiser uses the term. So if I have to correct that, that's what's going on there. So in just traditional Christian systematic theology, it's generally been the case that evil spirits are given the phrase demons. That means all evil spirits. And angels means all the good spirits. Heiser is using more restricted definitions of those terms. So there may be a bit of kind of bouncing back and forth between how those terms are being used in my discussion, because I'm bouncing back and forth between how he uses those terms and then the normal, more broad sense in which I have used those terms. So, all right, to clarify that. The second point that I wanted to bring up in response that I heard a lot was I mentioned that it seemed to me when I was reading The Unseen Realm that the kind of attitude that Heiser had was almost like he had this secret knowledge that church history hadn't understood this stuff before. And I had a lot of people pushing back on that, saying Heiser is very explicit that that's not the case. Now, I'm sure that he's explicit that that's not the case in other places. I have not listened to everything he said. And, as I said, people have been asking me to respond to this stuff for a number of years at this point. So I finally decided to give some thoughts on it. And some people are saying you shouldn't give any thoughts on this because you should only comment on this if you're an expert in ancient Near Eastern literature. Well, sorry, I've been doing this podcast for almost 10 years, and I've tried to think of new topics every week. So I'm not just going to do the topic of my dissertation every week. So it does mean that I'm going to go beyond my field of expertise at times, and that's part of what I'm doing as a podcaster. So if you don't want that, oh well. I try to acknowledge where my shortcomings are as well, and acknowledge this is where my criticism is coming from. This is my perspective. I don't have a background here. And that's precisely why I'm really not critiquing his use of ancient Near Eastern literature. I'm trying to discuss the differences in methodological approaches, because as a systematic theologian, methodological approaches are something that I am an expert in, because I have to think through that. I wrote a book on prolegomena, which is discussing how do you approach the text? How do you define what is truth and what is not? So those are areas that I feel like I actually can respond to quite well with the background that I have, acknowledging, of course, that I'm not an expert in all of the fields that Dr. Heiser is, and I don't pretend to be, and I wouldn't pretend to be, which is why I'm not critiquing certain ideas that I just am really not qualified to do. But I don't come from the opinion that if you're not an expert in a field or have a PhD in a particular field, that you can have no ideas about that field. I think we do this all the time, and we have to decide which experts we're going to trust and which ones we aren't in any field of knowledge, in science or in health and medicine, and just this is just kind of how the world more broadly tends to work. Okay, so with that being said, the response that this is really a misunderstanding of Heiser. I've spoken with a number of people who have read The Unseen Realm, and I had a number of comments that they said, yeah, he comes across that way. Like, that's exactly what I thought reading the text. So the way that he speaks about creeds and church history, it appears to me to be very disparaging, at least in the introduction to that text. And I think it's pretty clear as well. Now, he may not do that in his other works, and maybe he clarifies, maybe it's just kind of overstatement. And in that may very well be the case, I don't know. But that's certainly the impression that I got reading through the beginning of that text. So now I wanted to jump from there into the topic of the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6. And this is a major part of Heiser's thesis. And I'll just quickly read through this section of Genesis 6. I'm going to look at what Heiser says in his defense of his approach or his perspective that this is referring to divine beings. And then I'm going to push back a little bit on some of the things that he says here. Now, I want to say this. This is a really hard text. I'm not convinced 100% that my interpretation of this text is correct. It's a short text. I think that there are actually a number of pretty good arguments to read the text in a bunch of different ways. And there are a lot of texts that I wouldn't say that about, but there are some texts where it's difficult. And it's difficult because there isn't a lot of contextual information and you're working off of so little. This is one of those texts. And again, this gets back to the question of how do we establish doctrine, which I talked about last time, which is, do we base our doctrine first on the obscure text or the clear text? And my feeling in Heiser's approach is that he's using a lot of texts that could be read in a couple different ways, but then using them as interpretive paradigms for a whole lot else. So if it's true, for example, that the Nephilim, as Heiser reads them scripturally, if it's true that the demons are these disembodied spirits of Nephilim, and that's what we mean by demons, that's all depending, of course, on an interpretation that the Nephilim are these supernatural beings. So that is an establishing of a systematic theological point, a pretty major one of who are the demons, who are these evil spirits that we're fighting against, that Scripture talks a lot about in the New Testament. So it's pretty significant. It's not an insignificant thing. But your whole theology of who the demons are is now dependent largely upon, I would say, a questionable interpretation of this text. And it's not the interpretation that I take, and I don't think it's the best way to interpret this text. So let's just read now, starting in Genesis 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And that's kind of it. Like, we have a little bit of description later. Then we go on to say, there were giants on earth in those days, and afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So these figures that we call the Nephilim, that's kind of the whole description that we get. Now, we can look at some other texts. We can look outside of the Old Testament and look at some ancient Near Eastern texts, and we look at Second Temple Jewish literature, the Enochic literature, which certainly does interpret this in that way. I think there's no doubt about that. But in terms of what's actually said in the text of the book of Genesis, it is very little. There is very little there. So what do we see? We see that there are sons of God, daughters of men. Sons of God see the daughters of men, that they're beautiful. They're taking them as wives. And then they have children. And these children are the Nephilim. So these children are the product of the relationship between the sons of God and then the daughters of man. That's the Nephilim. So the question then is, who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of man? We actually have a number of interpretations of both parts of that. So Heiser's interpretation is going to be the more supernatural one. Now, there are, even among those who argue for a supernatural approach, there are a couple different ways that it could be interpreted supernaturally. One is that the sons of God are what we usually would think of as demons being a kind of disembodied spirits, or that these are the fallen angels in this approach. They are disembodied, and these disembodied spirits can somehow have sexual relations. And there's another view that says that there are spirits that are in these people, so they're kind of these divine human entities, kind of how you think of some of the Greek gods, like, right, being, or like a Hercules figure. So one who has kind of divine DNA in some way and human in another. So it's kind of a mixture. So they have a human body, so they can still procreate according to a human body. All right. There are a couple different ways to interpret that. Now, if you're going to take these are disembodied spirits, the main problem for that perspective, and this has been brought up by many people, this is often brought up there with that approach, is it doesn't seem to be the case that procreation is possible for a spirit entity. So we have, for example, Jesus talking about how the spirits in heaven, the angels in heaven, they do not marry, are not given in marriage. Now, it's not explicit. He doesn't say, by the way, they also can't take physical form and have sex. But, sex and procreation kind of go together. So it seems to be the most logical explanation with what we see Jesus there, that they probably don't have the ability to reproduce. And we know that the creation of the angels, or the angelic spirits, at least in a traditional sense, is that these spirits are all created at once. They don't procreate like humans do, that we procreate and make more and more. That's part of the call of Adam, the unique call of Adam. The angels, instead, were all created in a state of innocence, and then some of them make the choice to follow the devil. Others don't make that choice, and they are confirmed in righteousness. That's at least the traditional interpretation. Okay, that's my view. That's the traditional systematic theological approach from Roman Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran traditions. All right, so I think that you have then a problem there with that perspective. But you could take another perspective that says, all right, well, maybe they're not, sons of God are not entirely just these bodiless spirit beings, but there's some kind of mixture between humanity and the spirits are embodying them, which is this idea that now if the body dies, they are released from those bodies. Now they're disembodied spirits and are looking for a new home, and that's where you get demon possession. So let's look at some of Heiser's reasons for then affirming that interpretation. So as he affirms this interpretation, he is going to, first of all, he recognizes, he says this here, he's talking about the Sethite view. And we'll talk about what the Sethite view is if you're not familiar. He says, this has been the dominant Christian position since the late 4th century AD. In this approach, the sons of God in Genesis 6:1-4 are merely human beings, men from the line of Seth, Adam and Eve's son, who was born after Cain murdered Abel. Presumably, these 4 hidden verses describe, I don't know why I said hidden, it doesn't say that. I don't know what's in my head. These four verses describe, forbidden intermarriage between the godly men of Seth's lineage, or the sons of God, and the ungodly women of Cain's line, or the daughters of humankind. In this reading, everyone who lived on earth ultimately came from these 2 lines, and both of them lines descended from Adam and Eve's children. Both of their lines or those lines. In this way, the Bible distinguished the godly from the ungodly. So this is what he's presenting here is, so when he says the 4th century, he's really talking about Augustine. And it is true that there are a number of interpretations of this text in the pre-Augustinian era. So when we're talking about before Augustine's City of God, some do take a more supernatural interpretation. And there's no doubt that a more supernatural interpretation is the predominant Jewish interpretation. There's no doubt that Enochic literature had a very large impact upon the theology and ideas of Second Temple Judaism, so the Judaism of the days of Jesus. So it's not like that would be totally foreign to the Jewish world, and it's not totally foreign to the Christian world either. And it is the case that when you look at the apologists of the early church, you look at Justin Martyr or Tatian, or Irenaeus and others as well, but when they look at the sacrificing to pagan gods, they do see this as a worship of demons. There are exorcisms that are practiced along with baptism, as I've talked about in my exorcism episodes. So there certainly is a recognition that behind paganism or pagan worship, there are these evil or demonic spirits. So it's not like they're opposed to a supernatural interpretation of anything. So there is a divergence among the fathers on whether there's a natural explanation for this or whether there's a supernatural explanation for this. Now, what Augustine does is he makes the Sethite argument. So Augustine is, especially in the City of God, where he very clearly outlines these two lines. And he uses this line of Seth, line of Cain, as an interpretive grid to understand a large, especially the book of Genesis, but it extends even beyond that. Augustine has this paradigm of the city of God and the city of man. So that there have always been these kind of two competing cities on the earth. There's the devil's city and there's God's city. So the city of man being the city of the devil, essentially, and then the city of God being the kingdom of God. So he sees this as, in the Genesis context here, being played out in the line of Seth being the line of the city of God, and then the line of Cain being the line of the city of man, or the seed of the serpent, as we see outlined in Genesis chapter 3. From Augustine onward, that interpretation does become the predominant interpretation of the church. And, I'm not aware of all of the commentaries of the Reformation on this issue, but from what I have looked at, it seems like that is also the predominant view of both Lutheran and Reformed traditions following the Reformation. They're pretty much, lockstep with Augustine there. So the supernatural interpretation, it's not foreign from history. It's there, but it's definitely not the predominant one, at least from this point forward. In terms of the East, I've actually had a number of people contact me and say, well, the East has always agreed with Heiser's view, and other people have contacted me saying, these people keep saying the East agrees with Heiser's view, that they really don't. They're just trying to force Heiser's stuff into Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't know. I got no dog in that fight. So I will leave that one alone. And, you can give me your comments on that, but I really don't have, I have no place to say. I haven't looked into that issue. All right. So I've looked mostly through Lutheran resources because that's mostly what I do. So the interpretation then coming from Augustine is that you've got basically in Genesis, you've got Cain and Abel. And Abel's the firstborn son. Then you have, Cain is the firstborn son, right? Then you have Abel. Then you have, they both offer sacrifices to the Lord. The famous story of Cain and Abel, Genesis 4. Cain's sacrifice isn't acceptable. It's not accepted. The author of Hebrews, in commenting on this, seems to see the difference in the sacrifices, as Cain's was not done in faith, whereas Abel's was. So he gets mad at Abel. Abel's killed. We have the first murder in Scripture. And from that point forward, we see this expansion of these genealogies. It's a very genealogically heavy text, the beginning, well, all of Genesis is. Genesis is kind of divided into its various sections by genealogies. So there is a genealogy from Cain, and then there's a genealogy from, not Abel, because Abel's killed, the next born son, who is Seth. So after Abel is killed, as seemingly the kind of godly promised one, God then provides Adam and Eve with Seth, is the godly child. And from this perspective then, from Augustine's perspective, the sons of God who are mentioned in Genesis 6 are those who are coming from the line of Seth. They follow the faith of Seth. They're physical descendants, but they're doing things in faith, as Hebrews will interpret that. Whereas those from the line of Cain are not operating in faith. And so the sons of God are those like Seth, and then, the sons of man are those like Cain, who are not sons of God. So that's the Sethite interpretation. That's, for the record, and I'll talk about this a little bit too as I go on, that's not the only interpretation that takes a more natural view of this, because there's another interpretation that says that the sons of God are actually the descendants of Cain, and the daughters of man are actually the righteous ones. So we'll talk about what that means as well. And we'll look at Meredith Kline's interpretation from Kingdom Prologue, because there's some decent argument for that perspective as well. So let's now read, explaining that, where's the Sethite view is coming from, what is Heiser's critique of this? Okay, well, he goes on to say, and I give you the page number, but I'm reading this on my phone on my Nook app here, and I don't have page. It's in the Nook version, it's on page 95, if that helps anybody, but the paper version won't be exactly the same. Part of the rationale for this view comes from Genesis 4:26, where depending on the translation, we read that either Seth or humankind began to call in the name of the Lord. The line of Seth was to remain pure and separate from evil lineages. The marriage of Genesis 6:1-4 erased the separation and incurred the wrath of God in the flood. So there's supposed to be a separation of those who call on the Lord and those who don't call on the Lord. Those who call on the Lord are those who are related to Seth, and those who don't are related to Cain. Exposing the deficiencies of the Sethite view isn't difficult. The position is deeply flawed. So, all right, here we go. We're going to get the kind of knockdown arguments against the Sethite view. That's what he's going to say. And here's maybe part of my problem here with a lot of the Heiser and others that follow this approach. My problem isn't so much that they have this view, because I think it's an acceptable view and I can see where you'd get it from. But I think my problem is this is for sure the correct interpretation. This is just one of those texts where, like, I can see a couple different things a couple different ways, and I think there are decent arguments for it. You get this when you look at, for example, the passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul's talking about women wearing head coverings and explains the whole, this relates to the angels. I know Heiser's got a way of interpreting that, but it's a text where it's like, okay, I think we can be a little generous in how people interpret this, because we have to admit that it's not that easy to interpret. Same with the women who were saved through childbearing. Is it a reference to the virgin birth? I actually think it is, but there are others that argue otherwise, and I don't know that it's that clear either. So there are some texts like this, and I think this as well. All right. So here are his. He acts like it's real easy to just kind of tear this down. First point. Genesis 4:26 never says that the only people who called on the name of the Lord were men from Seth's lineage. And he goes on to say that idea is imposed on the text. All right, that idea imposed on the text. Now, I was kind of shocked when I read this. I was actually a little surprised at how bad I thought his argumentation was on this point. So I'll say in other points, I think he makes a good case. Here, I just don't think he's really dealing with the reason why people come up with the Sethite interpretation. Augustine doesn't have this interpretation based on nothing. He doesn't just come up with this and say, oh yeah, I think Seth's line was righteous and Cain's wasn't. He does get this from the text. Two ways he gets it from the text. One is this, and I think this is really important, is the question of what is the context in which the book of Genesis is written, and what is the purpose of the book of Genesis. I recognize that we're probably going to have different answers to that question, and our different answers to that question are going to guide how we interpret the text. But it's always an important question to ask, for what purpose was this book written? Now, I do believe in the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, which means that I believe that Moses wrote Genesis. Doesn't mean that there were never later emendations to the book of Genesis. Doesn't mean that Moses didn't use earlier sources in the book of Genesis to kind of compile, to put together this book. But largely, Moses is the author of Genesis. Jesus says that Moses wrote Genesis, and I affirm what Jesus says. So that's my take. And I know that many of you are going to say, no, you don't affirm the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Well, then you're probably not going to agree with what I'm going to say here. But this is my approach. I am a biblical inerrantist, and so that is the perspective I come from. All right. So, and yeah, I've lost credibility in half your eyes probably. Let's see. If Moses is the author of the book of Genesis, okay, if Moses is writing Genesis, and he is writing it in the context of the people of God being redeemed from the Egyptians, and the people of God really needing to have an identity. The people of Israel had now been taken out by God through the power through the means of Moses. They're in the wilderness. They're wandering the wilderness for 40 years before they enter the promised land. So the text is trying to define for them some really important and key questions. One of those is, well, who is the God that redeemed you? I think that's probably the most key. This God has redeemed us from Egypt, but who is that God? Second is, as people of Israel, like, who are we? Where did we come from? Well, what's our history here? How did we end up in Egypt in the first place? I'm sure that stories and stuff had passed on about these things. But that's why we have the stories about the patriarchs. So we have the story of who is this God, especially this is why creation is so significant, that Genesis 1 is describing who is this God. This God that redeemed you is actually the God who created the heavens and the earth. He's not just like these Egyptian deities. In fact, the Egyptians, they can worship the sun, but God can like have light on the earth without the sun even being made for a while, because he just doesn't feel like it. That's how powerful God is. So I think there is a lot of kind of polemical stuff going on in Genesis 1 against pagan polytheism and other ancient Near Eastern ideas about deity, and specifically the sun and stars. So that's there in Genesis 1. But then after Genesis 1, we start to see the explanation of, well, how did things get messed up? So the Israelites know things are messed up. They were captive in Egypt. How did that all start? Story of Adam and Eve. We've got the narrative of the fall. The division of nations is described in the Tower of Babel, which certainly they would have understood the division between nations, because they're like being taken captive and they're becoming their own nation at this point. They're trying to figure out how all of this came about. So at all of the details that Moses provides for the people of Israel in the Genesis account are very specifically relating to the mission and calling of the people of Israel, right? So we've got the question, who is God? Who are we and where did we come from? But then we've got the third question that Moses addresses is, how should we live in the land of Israel? How do we see and live out our identity as the people of God? And they're ultimately going to see that through the revelation of the law, through the giving of the Ten Commandments and the other ceremonial and civil laws that Moses receives and brings to the people of Israel. But they're also going to see some illustrations throughout the narratives of how their living in a certain way or not living in a certain way would fit into some patterns that we see even back here. So, what is the biggest danger that is repeated over and over and over again to the people of Israel? When they're about to enter into the promised land, they are supposed to wipe out the Canaanites. They're not supposed to live with the Canaanites. For what reason? Well, they're repeatedly told that they are not to marry foreign women and then adopt their gods, because they are going to fall into pagan polytheism. They are going to worship the gods of those who they marry. And that's going to be the downfall of the nation of Israel. They're going to fall into idolatry, and it's going to be through marriage. If that's the background, it makes perfect sense contextually that Moses is going to include a story at the very beginning to say, when everything got really bad, and things got so bad that God sent, this flood to wipe everything out. You know what led to that is the intermarriage of those who were children of God with those who were of the other line, right? Those who are separated from them, those who follow the devil. That's what led to the flood. So this serves as a warning to say, hey, don't do this, or this is what brings catastrophe. So it seems to just fit into the moral world of the Old Testament and contextually what Moses would be doing in delivering these words to them. So there's the first part of this, is the Sethite view comes not from nowhere. First, it comes from the context of Moses delivering it to the people of Israel and what would be most relevant to them. And why is this detail being included? Second part of this, whereas Heiser says that he says this is the antithesis of exegesis. There's nothing in the text that talks at all about Seth's lineage just being like the holy lineage and Cain's lineage being not the holy one. Again, the entire point of this is Moses is giving this to the people of Israel, who are people of one specific lineage. They are an ethnic lineage of Abraham. And they are not to intermarry very specifically with people of other lineages, because those other lineages are following false gods. So there's a setup between one lineage and another in the context in which Moses is giving these words. That's understood there, I think, to the first readers. But it's not just that, but it's in the text itself. Because we have, right after, we've got Cain and Abel, right? We've got the murder of Abel. Immediately after the murder of Abel, in Genesis 4, verse 16, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. So we have this imagery, and this is an imagery of sin and evil and uncleanness, that there is a departure from God's presence. So Cain, after his evil, he is protected. We have the establishment of civil law, that there are civil punishments. The death penalty essentially is what's established here. But then he's out of the presence of the Lord. Who else is out of the presence of the Lord? His whole line. He dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He has a wife. She conceived and bore Enoch. And then, apart from the presence of the Lord, Enoch built a city. And I think it also is significant that we have in the line of Seth another Enoch. We've got like bad Enoch and good Enoch. So we've got the two names there together. So we've got a bunch of names here, but those names lead to Lamech. Cain establishes the first city outside of the presence of God. Through his genealogy, we get Lamech. What does Lamech do? He takes for himself, in verse 19, 2 wives. Doesn't this sound like one of the things that's going to be the downfall of Israel? The kings of Israel wanting power in getting many wives, as the people of Israel and Deuteronomy, they're warned about this. They're not supposed to take for themselves many wives. And then we see this developed more, that Lamech says to his wives, Edah and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, and Lamech 77-fold. So we have a genealogy of Cain, and the entire genealogy of Cain is around disobedience. Like, that's the whole point, is Cain disobeyed God. He's kicked out of the presence of God. Then he's got a bunch of kids, which leads to Lamech, who's even worse than Cain. So of course there's a whole genealogy of this line is bad. Then we get to the answer to that, right? We've got this evil line. Lamech becomes this embodiment of the seed of the serpent. And so we've got the 2 seeds right there in the beginning of Genesis 3 as well. So this is all connected in the narrative. Seed of, again, Israel is already thinking about seeds because of they're thinking, who are we uniquely and how are we not to be of the seed of the Canaanites? Then we have the seeds of the serpent and the seed of the woman in Genesis 3. Then we see this theme of the seed being played out in Adam and Eve have 2 seeds. One is good, one is bad. The bad one kills the good one. The bad one, after being bad, is then kicked out of the presence of God, and then his seed also is bad and then gets even worse. Then we switch to the other line, which is the line of Seth. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son named Seth. For God had appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. So you see, it's not just, oh yeah, Seth called the name of the Lord. There's a whole line of people that's doing evil, and then there's a whole line of people from Seth that's not doing evil, that's doing the opposite, calling on the name of the Lord. Okay, so let's see. As we go on through this, we see Seth's genealogy. He begot Enosh, and then we're told, about how old he was. Enosh lived 90 years. They begot Canaan. Okay, let's move on. Mahalalel. We don't need to read all of the names. But the point is, eventually this gets to Jared and then Enoch. And as we read about Enoch, what are we told about Enoch in verse 21? Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah, who's the oldest man who ever lived. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So he's walking with God, and then he has sons and daughters. One might say that he was a son of God, and maybe his sons were as well. So then we have Methuselah, and then there's another Lamech. So there's a good Lamech along with the bad Lamech. And this Lamech is the one who's the father of Noah, by the way. Okay, so he's the righteous one, the righteous line. We have only bad people singled out in Cain's line and being out of the presence of God. In Seth's line, we have the people that are singled out are like Enoch, who walks with God and who is such a picture of righteousness that he just departs straight into heaven. And then through that line comes Noah. So the entire context is a contrast between these two genealogies. So I honestly think I don't know how Heiser can come to this conclusion honestly, or portray this honestly, for him to just say, it's not supportive of anything in the text. It's the antithesis of exegesis. Like, you can disagree, right? You can say, okay, I see that, but I still think that, especially with some of the Second Temple Jewish sources that Jude cites, it seems like there's there's more going on than just this. But to just say, oh, there's nothing in the text that means that at all, is so dismissive and just not honest with what the text says. Okay, so there, I'm being blunt, ready for you all to get mad at me about it. But okay. All right, let's see. Okay, so he says it's not present in the text, which is the very antithesis of exegesis. All right, let's see. Fourth, there is no command in the text regarding marriages or any prohibition against marrying certain persons. There are no Jews and Gentiles at this time. And here's where he's got kind of a very wooden interpretation of the text. It's like, well, it doesn't directly say, but if it's true that the context is Moses is talking to the people specifically about how they are to be set apart, he's giving them a history. Where the whole point of this is the history of Israel. This is where you come from. Israel is the continuation in some ways of the Sethite line, right? Israel is that line that is to be the one to offer pure sacrifices in faith, as opposed to those who are like Cain and like Lamech. So you don't have to have Jews and Gentiles yet, because the whole point is this is setting up what becomes the command to the Israelites, to be separate from the Gentiles of the surrounding nations. So I think it's very clear that there are these two lines. It doesn't have to be Jew versus Gentile very, very narrowly, but that God has always had these two seeds. That's the point. Israel steps into that role when God calls Abraham. Now it's the church that steps into that role, and it's not, an ethnic division kind of thing. But God has always had this seed that exists within the world of the serpent's seed. So, now let's go on. Fifth, nothing in Genesis 6, 1-4, or anywhere else in the Bible identifies people who come from Seth's lineage with the descriptive phrase, sons of God. That connection is purely an assumption through which the story is filtered by those who hold the Sethite view. Again, I'm going to push back on this. So, the phrase sons of God. Now, the argument that's going to be made, and I've heard this a lot, the argument that's going to be made for this interpretation is the particular phrase sons of God is used here and then in the book of Job. And as you read the book of Job, it is pretty clear that there are these kind of supernatural angelic figures that receive the title sons of God. The question that I have, though, is then, okay, you've got Genesis, which is written, I believe, long before the book of Job. And I think Job was much later. Job is a notoriously difficult book to identify. It's difficult to identify because it's a very different book, okay? It's a very different book in its genre, but it's also a very different book in terms of its historical setting and circumstance. It's difficult to give an exact date. I know a lot of older sources believe it was like, the oldest book written in the Bible. I'm not of that perspective at all. So, but regardless of the dating of Job, different author, different context. So we know that there is precedence at some point within Judaism, prior to the New Testament, some point, whenever Job was written, there is the use of the phrase sons of God that can refer to these angelic beings. Does it mean that sons of God means that here is the question we have to ask. And just because a phrase can be used in a certain way doesn't mean it's restricted to that use, especially when you're talking about different author, different book, different time period, completely different context. Now, if we had an extensive use of the phrase sons of God, it's like you can read through the whole Old Testament and repeatedly sons of God every time. It's just a shorthand for angelic beings or demonic beings or these supernatural beings. over and over again in a bunch of different books, okay, then you've got a pretty strong case. So I would say we know the term can be used to refer to that. But the problem, I think, is when you're so narrowly focused on, well, how is this exact phrase used? And is this exact phrase used in another place to mean something else? Because the entire context of, I think, the whole story of Adam is that Adam is a son of God. This is, for example, after Adam births Seth, we're told that Seth is made in Adam's image. In other words, that phrase, being in his image, is a reference to his sonship. So as a son of Adam, Seth is in Adam's image, which means if Adam is in God's image, Adam is a son of God. And we have this relational language of walking with God, again, with Enoch. And throughout the Old Testament, Israel, the nation of Israel, is referred to as the son of God. This father-son language, as we know it in the New Testament, is related to the church. But the language of the son is often used as language referring to the nation of Israel. So if God through Moses is setting up what is going to be Israel's understanding of itself, part of that self-understanding includes that Israel understands itself to be the son of God. There is a father-son relationship. Doesn't mean Job can't also use that at another point to refer to sons of God being angelic beings, where it's very clear that that's what he means. So to me, the question of does it say exactly sons of God, does it use that phrase exactly, doesn't really matter, because it's the theme that matters. And especially when we talk about the seeds at the beginning of the book of Genesis. So we've got this language of sonship, of seeds, of who do you belong to? Do you belong to the serpent? So I don't think it's acontextual to see sons of God if these are the kind of pre-Israelites. If Israel is learning, they are modeled on who these individuals were in the story of redemption, that they would be sons of God. And then the women being referred to as the daughters of man, because they're human, but they don't have this connection to the divine, because as we see with Cain's line, they are removed from the presence of God. So then the next part of this, he says, a close reading of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 makes it clear that the contrast is being created between two classes of individuals, one human and then one divine, sons of man being a divine beings. When speaking of how humanity was multiplying on earth, the text mentions only daughters, quote, the daughters are born unto them. The point is not literally that every birth in the history of the earth after Cain and Abel resulted in a girl. So let me ask the question then, which I think is important. Why is it that it specifically mentions sons of God and daughters of men? Because this is part of the hypothesis that these are supernatural beings is, well, it's because now we have these kind of demonic entities, whatever they are, impregnating human women, so that human women who can bear forth children are bearing these, I don't know, these monstrous things that are part human, part man, or part human, part Elohim, or whatever, divine in some way. But I think there's an easier way to explain why it specifically mentions daughters, because that's exactly going to be the temptation of the people of Israel. It's going to be men marrying women. It's going to be men marrying women who are pagans. And, this is even true today. I mean, as I watch couples come and go from the church, it's so often the case that the man just comes because his wife wants him to. And maybe he comes to true faith because his wife just said, you have to go to church. And he's like, oh, all right. This just happens. So it's the men are enticed by these beautiful women, and since they're enticed by the beautiful women, they can fall into the idolatry of the women. That's what's going on with the Israelites. So that's why the warning is specifically about daughters, because he knows that the men who are supposed to be guarding the worship of Yahweh, they're going to be the ones who are going to fold, because they're going to find these beautiful women that are Canaanites and going to say, okay, we'll marry them. So he's saying there's a precedent for that. That happened here. So don't do it. Okay. So I think there is a lot in the text that would lend itself to that approach. But then Heiser says in his summary, the Sethite hypothesis collapses under the weight of its own incoherence. It's just not true. I think whatever you want to do with this, you can make the argument that maybe the other text is stronger, but the Sethite text understanding does not come from nowhere. It's not just like a ham-fisted thing out of thin air. There are legitimate reasons in the context, purpose of the book, language use in the book, connection between this and the overall narrative of the Old Testament that it's setting up. There are plenty of reasons to argue for the validity of the Sethite hypothesis. All right, so let's then look at the other approach, right? Because there's another approach to this which says that, and this is kind of Meredith Kline's view that he takes. So this is in Kingdom Prologue here. Excellent book. If I'm talking about the kind of influences on me in terms of Old Testament theology, and again, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but the most influential figures in my own views are Meredith Kline, Gerhardus Voss, Gustav Ehler, and Augustine. Like those are my top four easily influences in terms of how to understand the Old Testament. So those are the sources. I'm looking beyond those sources for sure, but those are the ones that I find most compelling for whatever it's worth. I don't agree with Kline's interpretation here, but I also don't think it comes from nowhere. Okay, and Kline is one who is very well read in ancient Near Eastern literature. I mean, he pulls so much out that I think is very helpful. Sometimes I think he goes a little far out on some things, but largely I think he's very helpful. And so he speaks about human kingship and what goes wrong in human leadership or human kingship. And so he believes that sons of God is actually a reference to human kings. Now, why would sons of God be a reference to human kings, which seems a little odd? Well, he goes to other ancient Near Eastern literature where he points out that, and this is true, I've read enough to know this, but it's also true just of most ancient cultures, is that throughout history, it's often been understood, Rome did this as well, that the leader is a son of a divine being. The authority of the leader of a nation or the leader of a tribe comes directly from God. And so there is a special relationship that the leader has from God. So that's why the people should listen to that authority, that leader. They have authority because they are a son of God, a son of the gods or a son of whatever God one might be. So Kline makes the argument that it actually makes a lot of sense that this sons of God could be those who are leaders. They're giving themselves, in other words, the title sons of God. This is a kind of a self-imposed thing. We are the sons of God. And they are taking upon themselves the daughters of men. And because it says in verse 2, they took the sons of God, saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took for their wives all whom they chose. So he makes the argument that this is likely a kind of polygamous thing, and this kind of makes sense with what happens with Lamech. So contextually, there's argument for this. So, with Lamech, we see this evil guy, and he's kind of a ruler. He's got this lust for power. He's like wanting revenge 7 times what Cain did. He founds a city. So Lamech is set up as this evil ruler figure, and part of that usurping that authority is that he takes multiple women. So when you get into Genesis 6, if what's going on, if sons of God is a phrase that refers to leaders, which it is a phrase that means that, at least in some instances, in ancient Near Eastern literature. So it's not a foreign interpretation of that phrase. So this would be like Lamech, they're just grabbing onto all of the beautiful women. So it's part of their downfall is these corrupt leaders, and the sign of their corruption is they're just grabbing many, many women. And this is what then leads to, God seeing the evils that are on the earth. And in the context of Moses being the one who delivers this, it then could serve as a warning to the people of Israel that they shouldn't have leaders that get many wives and do all of these things that we see other places in the Old Testament, in the Torah, it's explicit, right? They're explicitly told not to do that. So this connection seems to make a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense within the ancient Near Eastern context. It makes sense with the connection textually with Lamech and what's happening there and the corruption of rulers. And it also makes sense with where Israel is in their history and some of the things that they would have needed to hear before entering the Promised Land. All right, so what are Heiser's arguments against this approach? First, the text of Genesis 6 never says the marriages were polygamous. That idea must be read into the passage. Well, it doesn't explicitly say that, but it does have the language of taking whatever women they saw as beautiful, which contextually, if you look at Genesis, just the chapter just before this, we see that that's the kind of thing. Sorry, it's Genesis 4. It's the end of chapter 4, not chapter 5. But we see exactly that. So I don't know that the text, I think that there's a fair argument to be made that it is implied contextually there. Second, ancient parallels restrict divine sonship to language of kings. Consequently, the idea of a group of the sons of God lacks a coherent ancient Near Eastern parallel. So he's saying, well, if a king is called a son of God, he's talking about many sons of God. But he is talking in a broader context here as well, because he's talking about the flood, which is pretty big, right? It's not just a regional thing. There are many rulers here that would be included. So I'm not convinced that would be the case either. Also, Psalm 82, depending on which text you see as the preferred one, there is an argument to be made that the sons of the Most High that are mentioned there are actually kings as well. Depending on which interpretation of that text you take. So there's a debate about it, right? So that's a debatable text as well. So there may be another phrase that means that. Psalm 82. I talked about Psalm 82, Jesus' interpretation, and I might go into Psalm 82 in more depth and read some commentary on that. But okay, third, the broad idea of human divine kingship elsewhere in the Old Testament is not a coherent argument against a supernatural view of Genesis 6. It was God's original design for his human children to be servant rulers over the earth under his authority as his representatives in the presence of his glory. So, I mean, that's true. I guess the odd thing to me here is that so much of Heiser's argument comes from like this kind of assumption of so many ancient Near Eastern ideas in the background. But this argument, if with his own methodology that he uses, I have a hard time following this argument because it seems to be the same kind of methodology that he himself is using in other ways. So, of course, it's God's original design for his children to be rulers under him, but that doesn't mean that there aren't people saying that they are sons of God or the gods or whatever, and that's the position of their divine authority. That's why they have that kind of divine authority. All right, so... All right, and I know I'm kind of at the end of time here. Now, what I've done here is I've overviewed these two different perspectives that Heiser argues against. And the one is the Sethite view, the one is Kline's view. I think the Sethite view is right. I do. I think it's the strongest view. I would also make one more point, that language of being a son of God or son of the gods it's used in ancient Near Eastern literature to refer to kingship, but it's also connected to priests and priesthood. So I heard David Falk mention this in relation to Egyptian understandings of priesthood. The priest was a son of that god that they were serving. And I actually think the context of priesthood fits probably better because, one, it does have an ancient parallels as well in terminology, but it also, I think, defends the Sethite view in that the relationship, first of all, I think there's a solid argument to be made that Adam's role in the garden is priestly. You can read someone like G.K. Beale on this, but I think that there's an argument to be made that Eden is kind of a sanctuary and Adam is a priest guarding that sanctuary. That language of priesthood is pretty clear, even in that, like, what's Adam's punishment is being removed from the temple, the place where God's presence is. So he's exiled. But as God gradually kind of brings his people back, this begins with a priestly offering with Abel. Abel is identified by his priestly offering, and Cain is rejected in the context of his bad priestly offering. So we have people like Melchizedek showing up later in the text, who is a priest of the Most High God. So the connection, I think, between priesthood and those who are sons of Adam, ultimately Christ being the ultimate high priest, is the fulfillment of this. But priesthood and presence of God and the line of Seth seem to all be very connected, so that it would make a lot of sense if son of God as a phrase connected to, other, say, Egyptian or other, and Egyptian would make a lot of sense because they were in Egypt. So okay. But in other cultures surrounding that, if they had this identification of sons of God as priests, then that actually makes a heck of a lot of sense. That it's the priests, the ones who are guarding the religion of the people, the ones who are guarding worship of Yahweh, they're the very ones being led astray by the daughters of man and falling away from worship of God. You could see why the consequences would be so disastrous. That's the perspective I take. So, after all of this, you may disagree with me. You may say that, hey, I think the argument's not that strong. But I just don't think it's fair to the argument to say it's just completely incoherent and there's no reason whatsoever. There are very strong textual reasons to hold this interpretation. And what I find most frustrating about the followers of Heiser's thesis that I have interacted with, and not everybody, but in a lot of the people I've interacted with, if you disagree with this interpretation, they throw out, well, you're just against the supernatural. You're just a naturalist. You're just a modernist. Which is a ridiculous place to go. It's this is from Heiser himself. I mean, he does kind of say it's really what motivates these people is they just don't want to have the supernatural stuff because it's too weird or something. It's just not true. Like that's not the reason I'm coming to this conclusion. And in many ways, I would say it's Heiser who's the modernist. Because as much as Heiser and his followers are opposed to the anti-supernaturalism of modernism, they read the text like as modernists par excellence, right? They're reading the text as this is a product of its religious culture and time, and we have to understand all of its ideas only with the intent of the original author and in light of what the surrounding religious ideas in that culture were. And that's a modernist approach to the text. The approach that I outline in my hermeneutical discussion starts with the divine authorship of the text and doesn't ignore the human authorship of the text, but recognizes that to some extent, even if Moses thought one thing, God could be speaking something else that he didn't understand through the inspiration of his words. So that's been, I think, the most frustrating is when people have come at me and call me modernist and all of this stuff. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. But to make that kind of argument, it's not fair or accurate. Okay, so, hopefully you kind of at least, even if you come away with this being like, this guy's a nut, his stuff is wrong. At least you can hopefully say, okay, I get where this is coming from, and I can see that it doesn't come from nowhere. But I can see that this other interpretation, Augustine had a reason for holding to this interpretation. Even if you don't agree, it's not fair to just say, you just don't like the text and you don't like the Bible and what it has to say. It's just silly. Anyway, let me know if you want me to continue this as well. The thing that I didn't get into, just because of time, is Jude and Peter. Let me say this. Those are the best arguments for the supernatural approach. They are the best arguments, by far. Based just on the text of Genesis, I don't see the supernatural approach at all. The reason why I say that I'm unsure of my approach, the Sethite view, the only reason I say I'm unsure is because of those texts. So there is an argument to be made there, for sure. So we'll maybe deal with that again. Let me know if you want me to do more of this. I'd be happy to do that. And I had some other scholars I wanted to look at and ways that they interpreted certain things, but we'll wait till next time. So thank you so much for watching and or listening, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.